Matthew 22, 1:14. The parable of the wedding feast. Matthew 22 opens with another parable spoken by Jesus in the temple courts during the final week before his crucifixion. He addresses the chief priests and Pharisees who had rejected his authority and resisted the message of the kingdom. The imagery of the parable draws from familiar covenant themes of kingship, invitation, celebration, judgment, and inclusion. Jesus begins, "The kingdom of heaven is like a king who arranged a marriage for his son." The king represents God, and the son represents the one through whom the covenant promises are fulfilled. The wedding imagery reflects language in which the covenant relationship between God and his people is often described as a marriage. The celebration represents the joyful culmination of God's redemptive plan as the promised kingdom arrives. The king sends servants to call those who had already been invited to the wedding feast, yet they refused to come. In the cultural context, invitations to such feasts were given in advance, and the later summons announced that the meal was ready. The refusal of those invited illustrates the persistent rejection of God's messengers by the covenant nation's leadership. Throughout Israel's history, the prophets had called the people to respond to God's covenant invitation, yet many refused. The king sends more servants, saying that everything is prepared, the oxen and fattened cattle are killed, and the feast is ready. This reflects the completeness of what God had prepared through the work of his Son. The kingdom had drawn near. The promises spoken through the prophets were being fulfilled. However, those invited disregard the message. Some return to their farms and businesses, while others seize the servants, mistreat them, and kill them. This mirrors the long pattern of hostility toward the prophets and messengers of God. The rejection of the invitation is not merely indifference, but in many cases, active opposition. The king responds with judgment. He sends his armies, destroys those murderers, and burns their city. The language corresponds to prophetic descriptions of covenant judgment throughout the Hebrew scriptures. When a covenant people rejected God's messengers and violated their calling, the prophets warned of destruction coming upon the city and the nation. The parable reflects the impending judgment that would soon fall upon Jerusalem after its continued rejection of the Son and his message. Afterward, the king declares that those originally invited were not worthy. The invitation is then extended beyond the initial group. Servants are sent into the highways to gather all they find, both good and bad, until the wedding hall is filled with guests. The expansion of the invitation reveals the widening scope of the kingdom. Those who had previously stood outside the covenant structure are now welcomed to the feast. The phrase both good and bad emphasizes that entry into the celebration is not based on moral qualification, but on receiving the king's invitation. The feast is filled entirely by those who responded to the call. Yet the parable introduces another element. When the king enters to see the guests, he notices a man without a wedding garment. In the context of royal feasts, garments were often provided for guests, signifying their acceptance into the celebration. The absence of the garment suggests a refusal to appear according to the provision of the king. The king addresses him as friend and asks how he entered without the proper garment. The man is speechless. The response shows that there is no justification for rejecting the provision made by the king. The guest has entered the feast while disregarding the condition associated with the celebration. The king commands that the man be bound and cast into outer darkness, where there is weeping and gnashing of teeth. This imagery echoes prophetic expressions describing the sorrow and anguish that accompany covenant judgment. The language highlights the seriousness of rejecting what the king has provided. Jesus concludes the parable with the statement, "For many are called, but few are chosen." The invitation goes out broadly, yet participation in the feast belongs to those who receive the king's provision. Within the larger narrative of Matthew's gospel, this parable stands as part of Jesus' confrontation with the religious leaders of his day. The kingdom had arrived in the person and work of the Son. The messengers had gone out announcing that the feast was prepared, and the invitation had been extended widely. The parable portrays both the rejection by many within the covenant nation and the gathering of a new assembly who would fill the wedding hall for the celebration prepared by the king.